Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming along, and a warm welcome to those of you who haven't been at the Institute before. I'm Yvonne Yevsethiou, and I'm a research analyst for the Defense and Military Analysis Program. And given that American voters only cast their ballots on November 6th, I think we're all still trying to make sense of the recent midterm election results and what they mean with regards to Congress's ability to constrain the US president in his domestic and foreign policy decisions. The House of Representatives went blue, while the Republicans added to their majority in the Senate, with some analysts being hopeful that these results could curtail some of President Trump's knee-jerk decisions, and others fearing a gridlock and poor governance. Nancy Pelosi, who is supposed to lead the House of Representatives, pledged during her victory speech to restore the Constitution's checks and balances to the Trump administration. But does the House have these powers, or have the checks and balances been eroded beyond repair? Do allied nations have a role to play, or have they been completely ignored or literally pushed away? Simo Dunigren, President. At a time when the liberal world order and its norms appear to be under threat, we couldn't have asked for a better speaker than Professor Saunders, who will unpack what lies ahead and examine whether the checks and balances are rigorous enough to constrain the president before the 2020 elections. Professor Saunders is an associate professor at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service and a core faculty member in the Security Studies program at Georgetown University. She is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, and previously she was an associate professor at George Washington University. Her book, Leaders Are at War: How Presidents Shape Military Intervention, won the American Political Science Association's Jervis Schroeder Best Book Award in International History and Politics. In terms of housekeeping, Professor Saunders will talk for around 20 to 25 minutes before we engage in a Q&A session. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for coming out on a gloomy Friday afternoon to talk about U.S. politics in a week when I have been riveted by U.K. politics, and wouldn't blame you if you were glued to. I've been glued to the news over here, so it feels like the midterms in the United States were a long time ago already. But I will try to help make some sense, and we are still grappling not only with the results of the midterms, but still grappling with the Trump presidency and Trump foreign policy more generally, and trying to make sense of it. So I will try to do what I always try to do when I try to put President Trump's foreign policy in context, which is to go back to some first principles and try to understand what's really new and different and unprecedented. That's a word that's thrown around a lot when we talk about President Trump and his foreign policy in particular. But not everything he does and not everything that's happening is unprecedented or is a direct result of his actions. And so we want to understand where have we been and what have the trends been, and that helps us put in context what then is really new. So is the U.S. presidency really unconstrained with respect to foreign policy, and particularly the use of force, which is my area of expertise? Who makes decisions to use force? I would say the short answer is presidents. I wrote a 300 and something page longer answer in the form of my book that comes to the same conclusion: presidents. But the reality, even I would say, is much more complicated than that and has evolved over time. So I want to, again, try to give you some sense of the trends, which I think really helps put President Trump in context. So how much freedom do presidents have to use force? And will the Democratic victory in the House elections last week make that much difference? Before we even get to domestic politics, which is, of course, crucially important, and we're watching that play out in real time here in the UK this week, I do think it's important to note that there are some things that constrain presidential action that just come from international politics, that presidents run up against the brick wall of international constraints. And I think one area where this has really been illustrated during President Trump's tenure thus far is North Korea. So we all remember the early months of 2017 when there was constant worry about tweeting about fire. And this was the summer of fire and fury, if you remember, and a very scary time watching these threats go flying across the Pacific. But if we take a step back and think about the problem of North Korea, and one of the thought exercises I often do when I try to think about the impact of any given leader is, well, if we took that leader out and if we could stop time and we could take that leader out and put a new leader in, would anything change? So imagine that Hillary Clinton had actually won the 2016 election, and it was a close election, so that's a perfectly plausible counterfactual. North Korea would have had its nuclear program just the same, would have been a problem for any U.S. leader. So it's not as though we wouldn't have had a confrontation with North Korea in the early months of 2017. We can say that with fair certainty. It's also the case that despite the rhetoric and the tweeting and the threats, there are some structural features of the North Korea situation that are extremely difficult for any leader to change. And the most sort of immovable one of these is the mere fact that the Korean Peninsula shares a border with China. And that fact, immovable fact, can't be changed by any U.S. president, no matter what party they're in. It really imposes severe constraints on what leaders can do short of all-out war, because it gives the Chinese such an interest in fighting back or protecting their North Korean client state should war actually break out. And we've of course fought a Korean War already. The United States has participated in that. In the Korean War in 1950 and 1951, and the Chinese intervened. So we have some evidence to know how that would actually play out in practice. And so I think it's always important to keep in mind that President Trump may say things and tweet things, but there are these international constraints that neither he nor Hillary Clinton could have done anything about. So that is an important set of constraints, but unfortunately that they don't exist everywhere, and there are a lot of places, think of the Middle East, where presidents have a lot more leeway. So what about Congress? What other U.S. domestic checks could possibly constrain presidents? And Congress is always the next one that comes to mind, the first one when you start to think of domestic constraints. So in a recent piece with James Goldgeier of American University that was published in Foreign Affairs this fall, we argued that the Congress as a foreign policy and national security check on the president has been in decline for a long time. And really that decline began long before President Trump took office. And we put down a lot of this decline to the end of the Cold War, which meant that it just became less and less politically useful to members of Congress to check to get foreign policy credentials, to advertise their foreign policy knowledge, to invest in national security expertise. The Cold War era, where you would have sort of defense and national security wonks in Congress who would be on the major committees, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Armed Services Committee. These are the people who, when there was a new and complicated arms control agreement, those were the senators that their colleagues would turn to get, and they were the ones who would get deeply involved in the details and know all of the details of these treaties. If one senator would support the treaty, that senator might, if it was the right senator, could bring along 30 votes, right? So the deep expertise that you saw during the Cold War has become increasingly scarce. And some of that is that some senators have just retired, some have moved into administration positions and then retired, like Senator John Kerry became Secretary of State, Joe Biden left to be Barack Obama's vice president, but their ranks have not been replaced, certainly not in the Senate. The other crucial dimension that is affecting virtually all aspects of American politics at the moment is partisan polarization. It has become much, much more difficult to have bipartisan anything in Congress, and that includes increasingly foreign policy. And those two dimensions are not totally independent. So a more polarized Congress means there's less incentive to invest in expertise, less likely that an expert across the aisle, a defense expert across the aisle, can convince members of both parties. It makes everything harder. And you basically start many of these foreign policy decisions with everybody already lined up on either side and not a lot of room for discussion in the middle. So those are trends that started long before Trump. I think you saw this very powerfully in the way that the Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, was handled by Barack Obama, he saw that it's basically impossible in the United States to get a treaty passed anymore. Presidents on both sides of the aisle have experienced this. And so President Obama decided that he would submit the Iran deal to Congress as an executive agreement, and he would have loved to have Congress approve it, but instead all he could do was put a vote of disapproval and hope that the vote of disapproval failed. And it was a procedural mechanism designed to get around the requirements of needing two-thirds vote in Congress, which is just basically impossible to get anymore. And in the end, Senator Bob Corker, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and a Republican, agreed to go along with this plan, which was basically his way of approving the Iran deal without having to vote for it, right? And these sorts of procedural maneuvers are a sign that partisan polarization has really begun to eat into the ability of Congress to back the president on riskier or unpopular initiatives. And so these initiatives, the downside of this is that agreements like the Iran deal become much more easy to undo by the next president. These agreements are less sticky. American commitments are less sticky, less credible. On the other side, when there's a presidential action that some members of Congress would like to constrain the president on, it's much, much harder to do that when you can't get votes from the president's own party. So partisan polarization, which certainly did not begin with Trump and is tied into the end of the Cold War, has really eroded the constraints on the president. There have been some exceptions, even before the midterms. Probably the area in which Republicans in Congress have the most distance from Trump on almost any issue is Russia policy. And there has been some real pushback from Republicans in Congress who are not pleased with President Trump's approach to Russia, think it's overly friendly, and there are mechanisms. Congress lacks a lot of levers that it can pull. Presidents have many, many more tools in their toolbox for foreign policy and national security, but they do have sanctions. And so congressionally initiated sanctions are one way in which the Congress has actually pushed back a little bit on Trump, and you've seen hints that they may try to do some of that on Saudi Arabia, where since the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, there has been actually some pushback from Congress. But those, again, are the exceptions that sort of prove the rule. So what about the midterm elections? What, if anything, changed? Well, for one thing, the difference between the House and the Senate is really crucial. So the Senate is where there was probably a net gain of 1 and possibly 2 seats, and there's 1 seat in Florida, I think, that's still being recounted, but will probably go for the Republican. So let's say there's a net gain of 2 seats for the Republicans. It's not a huge majority, but increasingly in the Senate, that's enough to dominate the agenda. And it gives the Senate, the Republicans, majority control over the agenda. The Senate is really the body that has traditionally been the foreign policy and national security heavyweight of the 2 chambers, and so in terms of constraints, that means that there's not really going to be that much change, right? The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee are the 2 traditionally, at least during the Cold War, bodies that have had the most oversight, the most constraint on the president. And there's a wonderful book by a scholar, a U.S. scholar named Linda Fowler, who she documents the decline in Senate Foreign Relations Committee and Senate Armed Services Committee oversight since throughout the Cold War, from its height in the Korean War and the Vietnam War down. The degree to which the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan generated congressional oversight was far, 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 far less. So there's already been a trend downward, and it's not going to change much because there was not really a turnover of control, nor was there a dramatic increase on the Republican side. So that's essentially a status quo. On the other hand, the House obviously did change from Republican to Democrat, and that may provide, there are comparable committees that might be incentivized to be more vigorous because they don't have their Senate counterparts doing oversight. Oversight is going to be the watchword. That's going to be the House Democrats are going to be saying oversight, oversight, oversight. So why not do some foreign policy oversight in the House Foreign Affairs Committee and so forth? So you might see some of that. I think the other sort of less less obvious way that you might see some change, although it's going to be a slow change, is that there is a cohort of new members of Congress, most of whom are Democrats, who are former national security professionals. They have a wide variety of backgrounds. Some of them are former CIA officials, former Defense Department, Pentagon officials, at least one, if not two, from the State Department. They would have most recently worked for the Obama administration just because that was the last administration before Trump, but many of them also served under Bush because they would have been career civil servants. And there's a number of them, and many of them ran. They were recruited to run, and they ran as Democrats, and they won all over the country. So you have, for example, Lisa Slotkin, who won in Michigan, Tom Malinowski in New Jersey. You have Abigail Spanberger in Virginia. You have a few more in Pennsylvania. These are California. These are all in all different parts of the country. You have this new cohort coming in. The catch is that most of them ran for reasons other than their national security experience. So many of them, Andy Kim in New Jersey, for example, does have a national security background, but really ran on health care, right? So initially, they are going to be going into Congress, into the House, where they're going to face a re-election in 2 years. All members of the House are elected every 2 years. And these will have been in competitive districts. So if there's a tilt back to the Republicans, the people who were the last to be elected in will be the first to be targets for the Republicans the next time. Their constituents are really going to be focused on healthcare and the economy, right? Voters don't usually focus that much on foreign policy. So it's not clear how much they're going to want to put their national security experience front and center. But it's undeniable that that's a sort of regeneration of the sort of lifeblood of the national security expertise in Congress. So that's a good, healthy sign if you care about national security expertise in Congress. It would be great if some of them would then move up to be elected to the Senate eventually, because that's where you really see the 6-year terms, investment and expertise over the long run. Incidentally, it would be great if that happened on both sides of the aisle. I mean, I think this is really a kind of a bipartisan an issue on both sides, that it would benefit from more foreign policy and national security expertise. But we're a long way from where we were in the Cold War. So just to give you a flavor of this, in 1971, 73% of members of Congress had served in the military, and a decade later, that figure was 64%, and we're not going to come close. I mean, there have been a number of veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars who've been elected, but we're not going to come close to that anytime soon. But again, it isn't just veterans who've been elected, it's these civilian professionals, and that's all very healthy to have a good mix of different types of people in Congress with different kinds of knowledge. So what about the bureaucracy, right? We've had a lot of discussion in the Trump era about the so-called deep state and whether there's a sort of conspiracy from the bureaucracy, and I think that rhetoric is overblown and sort of in some cases sort of an inappropriate analogy. But this is another trend that I think we have to look beyond Trump, right? There is a long-standing trend in the United States of centralizing foreign policy expertise in the White House, and increasingly cutting the State Department and the civilian side of the Defense Department, in some cases, out of decision-making. And that has some advantages for presidents because they are able to draw on what they see as more loyal. They can put their loyal people in the National Security Council, get who they want to hear from, right close in the NSC, which is sort of attached to the White House. On the other hand, diplomacy is very much about patience and long-term expertise. I've done some research on where presidents and secretaries of state travel, and it is not to places to fly and meet the adversary one-on-one, which is the kind of diplomacy President Trump tends to like to do most. It's this patient visiting with allies and reinforcing relationships, and that's the State Department's bread and butter. And as they have over time been cut out more and more, that is really the price of centralizing so much foreign policy in the White House. So then what is it about President Trump then that is so unusual? What's unusual is not that trend, right? That trend predates him. It's it's the fact that he did not, when he initially appointed his foreign policy advisors, he did not draw on the sort of bench of the Republican Party, the people who had sat out the Obama years but had come out of the Bush administration and were ready to go back into government to serve the next Republican president. And that is very much the sort of engine that makes foreign policy run, for better or for worse. And there's some downsides to that too. But if we're just trying to identify a change, that's a very big change. And the people he appointed, by and large, are outsiders. And so that is, I think, really what the difference is. And we can certainly talk about what the implications of that are. But I think it's worth noting that the centralization and the cutting out of the State Department is not what's new. The other thing that's new is that he simply hasn't appointed people to the State Department. We only just, when I landed in London on Wednesday, I saw that we only just had an ambassador to Saudi Arabia appointed this week. That's astounding, right? For a relationship that's that crucial and that has been so under the microscope for the last couple of months. And that's happening all around the world. There are crucial, ambassadors not appointed, deputy assistant secretaries not appointed. He wants to, apparently, there's a rumor he wants to replace the Department of Homeland Security secretary, which is sort of the equivalent of Home Secretary. But there's no deputy. So if he wants to get rid of the top person, there's not someone to sort of immediately backstop. So the lack of appointments, which erodes the expertise, and then again, if you think over the long term about how people advance and get promoted, it means that there will be a hole for the next person trying to draw on the pool of available people and the available talent, and it will mean that people are less experienced. Mm-hmm. So that is really that I think is really what's new on the bureaucracy side. A final. Ivani raised the question of allies, which is something that Jim and I address in our piece. Increasingly, alliances have become politicized in the partisan sense. And we saw a little bit of this in the Iraq War. We all remember the jokes about freedom fries after the French would not support the Iraq War. The Republican who was in charge of the cafeteria in Congress decided that they would no longer serve French fries; they would serve freedom fries, right? And this was their way of making being anti-French a Republican position. But increasingly, it has become a partisan issue whether to support alliances, and being against in general alliances is one of President Trump's core beliefs. Right. So I think that it's increasingly unlikely that we will see the kind of constraints from allies in the sense of worrying about what allies will think or wanting to consult with allies and being constrained from doing something if the allies really disagree with it. That was a common feature in the Cold War. President Trump didn't start the trend away from allies. It became harder and harder and harder to get UN approval. Presidents had to get more creative. President Clinton had to do this in terms of getting authorization for the operations in Bosnia and Kosovo through NATO and so forth. So again, not a new trend, but dramatically accelerated under President Trump. So what's the upshot of all this? Presidents have always had a lot of leeway to use force. Even during the Cold War, they had a lot of leeway to use force, even when these checks and balances were healthier, when the state of checks and balances were healthier. But the trend long before Trump was to loosen what constraints existed, and that put Donald Trump in the Oval Office with the ability to wield a lot of power. And the elections last week certainly have reintroduced some constraints. But if we think in terms of a president reaching for the phone, any president reaching for the phone to call the Pentagon and order the military to send troops someplace, or do anything that, I focus on the use of force, but we could think of almost any policy issue where the president has the ability to be the first mover, to pick up the phone and make an order, what would constrain him? Either in his mind, thinking about, okay, well, what is so-and-so going to think about that? Or what is Congress going to think about that would keep him from picking up the phone at all? Or if he does pick up the phone, that would impose some cost on him for doing so. And it's harder and harder to imagine what those constraints would be. So I think that a Democratic House only changes that picture marginally, would be my my sense. And if anything, if the Democratic House results in domestic gridlock, because there's not going to be much legislation that the president can get through without Democratic approval. And typically in the second half of a term, you wouldn't see a lot of legislation anyway. That's certainly not new with Trump. Typically, you see presidents turn to foreign policy under those conditions because they have a lot more leeway to conduct foreign policy. So stay tuned, because it could be quite bumpy from here.
Even more.
So I think I'll stop there, and I would love to hear from you, from your questions, and what perspective you've been observing the changes that we have been following so closely in the U.S.
Well, thank you very much. That was a very, very interesting talk. You gave us a lot about international constraints, midterm elections, and what the results mean, what it means for the bureaucracy being centralized, the alliances being polarized, and then concluding that we're talking about a marginal change.
Sorry if you were expecting more dramatic news. But.
So the floor is now open. If anyone wants to pose a question, just please raise your hand and introduce yourself to the speaker. Well, I'll take the advantage of being the chair.
Sure.
And ask you a question. So you talked about the expertise being centralized in the White House and away from the State Department. So I was thinking, are there any incentives to bring them back to the State Department, or President Trump, like any other president, will have more incentives to keep them, because you talk about loyalty and...
Right. That's a great question. The NSC has grown, the National Security Council has grown in size dramatically. We have the statistics in the article off the top of my head. It's in the hundreds. It's many hundreds of people now. It was something like 19 people under Harry Truman in the late 1940s, which was arguably a time of dramatic change in the international system and in the U.S. national security architecture. Think of the origins of NATO and the Korean War, and it was 19 people. So, and a lot of people, Democrats and Republicans, have said they think the NSC is too big. So that's a problem, again, that didn't start with Trump, and that a lot of people recognize that is a problem. Now, many of those people, it must be said, are seconded or on detail from the State Department, from the Defense Department. I don't want to imply by any stretch that they're all political loyalists. They're not. But the closer they are to the White House, the more tied in they are to the people who are political appointees. Now, it's good to have political appointees on the NSC that the president trusts. Advice does nobody any good if the president isn't going to listen to it, right? So there's an argument to be made, and scholars have looked at this sort of tension and trade-off between the loyalness of the advisor and the independent expertise of the advisor. And all independent expertise that nobody listens to is not good, and all loyalty that isn't expert isn't good either. So you want to strike a balance. And I think the consensus by the end of the Obama administration is that this had gotten way out of balance, right? But then what you had, instead of a rational discussion about what to do, you just had more of that. In fact, the NSC has been shrinking just because Trump doesn't even like the NSC that much, and wants loyalists. And then also the gutting of the State Department. So that is clearly not healthy for a rebalance. It's always hard. Presidential candidates love to campaign on executive power as a bad thing, right? President Obama campaigned against executive power, the excesses of the Bush administration in accruing too much power to the president. What did he do when he was elected? He promptly accrued more power to the president, right? Presidents, offices that have power do not like to give it up, just as a general rule. So it will be difficult, as with any institution that has power and resources, to cut back the NSC. So I mean, when we published this article, we struggled with what to say in the conclusion about what would change anything. And is there some, you ideally would want to have some reform that you could do, some institutional change that would help. And we sort of came to the conclusion that we didn't think an institutional change would do much, and that what really produced the investment in expertise and what influenced polarization was the Cold War. And so, not that one would wish it by any stretch, but what would it take to regenerate some of the expertise would be a crisis, but really for the rise of China to become as big an issue as the rise of the Soviet Union was in the late 40s and early 50s.
Excellent.
Yeah, or do you want to field questions?
No, absolutely.
Yes.
I'm understanding. So we hear in the news about how people in the Trump administration have been taking documents off his desk and basically just forgets about it. So are you in the camp that thinks that Trump has a clear foreign policy strategy, or is it just completely random, whatever he feels that day?
So that story made it over here, did it? That was the first day of the semester at Georgetown. So this is a great question, because I think people often say that Trump has no fixed beliefs, and so whatever the last thing he heard is the thing that will drive policy. But a wonderful scholar at Brookings named Tom Wright, who does a lot of work on Europe, but also has studied the Trump administration very closely, he published an article, I believe it was in Politico magazine, exactly a year before the Trump inauguration. So January 20th, 2016. So remember, that's a year before almost a year before the election and a year before the inauguration in 2017. Saying Trump has 3 fixed beliefs, and he traced them all the way back to the 1980s. So it's called something like Trump's 19th century foreign policy. There's 3 things that Trump reliably and identifiably has believed for a long time. 1, he's against trade policy. 2, he's against alliances. And 3, he's in favor of authoritarian regimes. And if you think back over the last almost 2 years, almost every single thing that he has done where he's really, like, you can tell that it's him, it's his initiative, or that he's sort of really put his weight behind, is consistent with that picture, right? He pulls out of the TPP. Every one of these NATO summits has been fraught. G7, G20, the last week in Paris, right? I mean, it's all the regular bilateral summits have become, and the multilateral summits have become incredibly difficult. And they used to be properly, I mean, I don't say this at all pejoratively, boring, right? And boring is important, right? Boring is it's like an insurance policy. It's not, you don't like to spend money on it because it feels like throwing money away until the moment when you need to cash, you actually need the insurance, right? Those 3 beliefs, I think, are what anchor his foreign policy. Everything else, I think, is a little bit more twists in the wind. So I don't agree that he's completely subject to the whim of his advisors. Now, the other dimension of this is information flow. He's not a consumer of information in written form. He doesn't read books. I mean, if Bob Woodward and the reporting that that's as much as we can ever know at this stage. But all evidence suggests that he's far more frighteningly, he's not actually listening to the CIA briefers, right? He's not relying on his own intelligence agencies. And so some of that article about the taking of papers off the desk is about controlling the information flow. And that's always a problem. Again, that's not a new problem. That's a problem that all staffers face, all administrations face, the problem of collating information. There is so much information coming at presidents. It's just astounding, right? When I go to an archive to do research on a particular decision to use force, the archival papers will be organized by topic, and I'm reading only the bits about, like, the decision to go into the Vietnam War. But on any given day, that will be alongside decisions about, if we're talking about Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, civil rights, right? There are things coming out from all sides. So the problem of information flow is not new, but the degree to which he consumes very little information, and therefore any given piece of information can be highly influential. That's what's new. Yes.
William Saunders, currently advising Cathay Pacific on international affairs. So it's South China Sea, Korea, right up there on the agenda. What does the president do when he finds that what he's trying to do is not just not working, but he's been taken for a fool, which may well happen in the case of Korea?
That's a question that's been much on everybody's mind. There was a piece published in the New York Times, I'm sure you saw. Feels when you're traveling, it's always the time. I think it was Monday, but by David Sanger and I think one other byline, saying that there had been this deception that North Korea had deceived the United States because there were sites that were. And there was a lot of pushback on this from North Korea experts because, in fact, they said, well, there was no deception. He never promised to denuclearize. This is entirely consistent with their program, right? So the real concern is whether Trump sees a headline like that and says, oh, it's a deception. I've been had. And so that is the concern, because almost no expert that I know of believes that the North Koreans will give up their nuclear weapons. It makes perfect sense why they want the nuclear weapons. It's invasion insurance. They have it, and the United States can do deterrence, can get into a stable deterrent relationship with North Korea, just as it did with China and so forth in the Cold War. There are plenty of reasons to talk to the North Koreans. It doesn't mean we shouldn't talk to them, but what will be on the agenda would not be denuclearizing the Korean Peninsula. It would be controlling the number of missiles, safety, testing, exporting of nuclear technology, nuclear material, all the things that we typically think of when we think of talking to other nuclear powers and making agreements, right? Things that will help make the relationship stable and reduce the risk of accidents and further spread of nuclear material. But he's fixated on this idea of denuclearization. And so I can only speculate, but I suspect that his advisors spend a lot of time trying to control the information that reaches him and how it's framed. I think it depends on which advisor. There are some advisors who are more in favor of the regime change or pretending that denuclearization is in fact the goal than others. It's a bit of a dicey situation. The military, I think, is the agency that would obviously be most acutely aware of just how dangerous this is. And again, you go back to this hard structural constraint of the border with China, and that in the end is what will make it very hard. That will a war on the Korean Peninsula would be so damaging and would involve the Chinese almost certainly in some, or the shadow of Chinese intervention would affect it in some way, that one would hope that at least even on the Korean side, Kim Jong-un has been nothing if not strategic and rational, that would prevent conflict from breaking out. But I would not say the danger is over, right? The real danger is if President Trump feels that he's been deceived, even though he has not been. Yes?
So looking at countries like India, for example, who are, I won't say ignoring, but not complying with sanctions on Iran, Russia, such like buying oil, buying arms. We've got Trump on one hand going, there'll be repercussions, yet then signing waivers to let them do it for a bit longer. What's his thinking on that? Is he being constrained by his inability to do anything, or is that governmental pressure from elsewhere? Do you know what his...
So I think that the Iran deal is a case where he's relatively unconstrained because it wasn't a treaty, right? And so his decision to back away from the Iran deal is a hard one to for Congress to do much about. And the waivers, so there's going to be reimposed sanctions, but then some countries that want to sort of go around the sanctions will be granted waivers. And this was portrayed in the press as sort of a Trump went soft on these countries in the end and didn't follow through on his threat. But I think the other way to frame it is Trump reimposed sanctions and only marginally changed the degree to which he's going to punish these third countries. And the net effect of all of that is going to be to vastly erode the JCPOA, the Iran deal, right? It will be so much harder without the United States to keep the multilateral framework of the Iran deal in place, which was very much effective because of its multilateral nature, right? That there was no place for Iran to go. And so I don't think the waivers really should take away from the narrative that it was a major reimposition of sanctions. And that was the administration's clearly stated intention. They say that. And so I think that the real question is, can anyone constrain the administration from attacking Iran if they decided they wanted to do that? And I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it could be that somebody can. It could be the military. It could be voices within the military. It could be other voices in the NSC. But I think thus far, like that's what the new approach to the JCPOA. I mean, they've said they don't support it anymore. So that's the next logical question to ask. I should say I don't think it's likely at any given day, but it's logical to ask it, I think.
A follow-up question, if I may. So, does the president actually listen to anyone? Because we've seen loads of people within this administration resigning or being forced to resign. So what happens when President Trump doesn't agree with someone from his administration?
Well, there's been some evidence that he will be constrained, at least for a time. In the beginning, apparently General Mattis, I should not call it, if Corey Shockey were here, she would be so mad at me. I must get on record, sorry Corey that I said General Mattis, former retired General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, had some influence on Trump, at least from what we read in the press, based on reporting in the beginning of the administration. Allegedly, Trump is now much more reluctant to listen to him. But Trump has always shown a great respect, for better or for worse, for the military, so one could imagine that. But it's so hard to follow the ups and downs of who's in and who's out. I mean, I think he's shown time and time again that constraints are relatively short-lived, and any given person, the longer they're around, the more vulnerable they are. I mean, some turnover is natural after a midterm. Presidents always lose seats in midterms. It's a little bit like a thermostat, right? Barack Obama lost something like 60 seats, but that was partly because they had gained so many seats in 2008 that they had further back to go. But it's natural for presidents to lose seats in midterms. It's natural for advisors at the 2-year mark to say, I mean, these jobs are incredibly intense, and 2 years is often as much as people can manage, or else they move up to a new job or move laterally. So departures and reshuffles, it's natural. But the rate of turnover has been extraordinary. Yes.
I'm Zoran Alexander, King's College student. I would like to ask you, to what extent do you believe that Trump's stance on European allies is a product of his own preferences, the fact that he simply dislikes them or disagrees with them on many issues, and to what extent have the Europeans kind of positioned themselves that way through their past actions? Because if you look at it, after the end of the Cold War, the Europeans have seemed to begin to distance themselves from the Americans before Trump. Like there was, and not just in the Bush administration with the Iraq War and over the New Europe and all that. It was also during the Obama administration, if we think about, for example, Ukraine and the famous dialogues with Victoria Nuland and all that. So to what extent we see people talking about how Trump views them as strategic competitors, but haven't they in a way triggered this? Because during the Cold War, their role was practically being the little brother in the relationship with the US. And the fact is that they seem to want to preserve the alliance just as it was during the Cold War, but without accepting anymore to be the little brother. We hear about strategic autonomy and all that, and I'm wondering whether you can ask that from the US, who is basically ensuring European security without accepting to be the little brother and even trying to school them on morals and stuff like that. I'm just wondering if it...
Well, I think you're right that this is not a new problem. I mean, I remember the Clinton administration where, what to do about Iraq did in the Clinton administration, where the choice was sanctions or engagement, and the French, broke the embargo. Those debates are not new. They've gone in presence of both parties. I think you're absolutely right about that. And calls for the Europeans to spend more on defense are also not new. There's a wonderful piece that we published at the Washington Post Monkey Cage blog, where I'm one of the editors, by Jim Goldgeier, where he documented all the times that presidents since the end of the Cold War had asked the Europeans to contribute more to NATO. Right? This is a routine thing that presidents would do at NATO summits, say spend more. I think, though, that so what's new and different about Trump? He seems to think of this in really absolute terms, and he thinks that the alliance just has no value at all. I think. I think that if that's the subtext of what he's really, he sometimes catches himself or says, no, it's good, but only if they pay as much. He doesn't think it's worth it anymore. His comments about Montenegro, I think, were, why should Americans die? Would you want to send your son to? So that, I think, is new. I think the other question is, for some countries it's about money. For other countries, what would it mean to, money is not really the issue with when you talk about the German army, right? What, you can't just generate an army out of the capabilities of the United States that would have to be replaced if the United States pulled out of Europe cannot be solved in a time frame that's reasonable with just an increase in defense spending of a few. It's just, you're going to make a German army out of nothing tomorrow. It just isn't going to happen, right? For a variety of reasons we could spend all day talking about. So I think that it's just the sort of extreme way that he's positioning these problems that's really what's new. Even though, as you say, the problem itself is not new. Yes.
Malcolm Savage, former Member of Parliament. How far do you think John Bolton has influence, will have influence on him, particularly given, to take two issues? You mentioned Iran, the possibility. I gather that Bolton is one of the people in this administration who is heavily influenced by the MEK, the curious MEK sect. But also, obviously, one of the great worries is with a number of major decisions to be made in connection with arms control and disarmament in the next couple of years. How far Bolton's long-standing detestation of multilateral treaties and disarmament, arms control and disarmament in general, how far is the risk there?
He lost a battle this week, which is a very strange story. That reads almost like a soap opera. When his deputy, Mira Ricardo, was... Actually, it's entirely possible she's still there because it was all happening when I was flying overnight. But the story when I left was that Melania Trump, the First Lady, had basically said that she didn't think that the Deputy National Security Advisor... So right away, what I've just said is highly unusual, right? That the First Lady would be weighing in on personnel matters on the National Security Council at all, much less at that level. And all signs were that she was going to be dismissed. I confess that I haven't followed the story since then. But nonetheless, she will be very much a weakened player, I think. So that's a sign that Bolton is not always in the good graces of the president. I have always thought that Bolton thinks more about international law and his views on treaties than about the details of what happens when they're gone. So I think that he has a history of aggression and aggressive stances towards North Korea, but I actually think he cares more about Iran than North Korea. And so it would not surprise me if he, let some of the North Korea stuff slide from here on out in favor of worrying about Iran. But I think the more general thing is his interest is in pulling back the United States from these multilateral commitments. So I don't think he's going to be. I think he's not in favor of arms control. I think he's, for as long as he's around, that's not going to be an area of where you have to see a lot of progress. The question is, how long is he going to be around? And that just gets back to the previous question: is the longer people are around, the more vulnerable they become to the president's whims. So I don't have a great answer for that, but Trump's on his third national security advisor, and we're not even 2 years in. So the betting wouldn't statistically be that he'd be around forever.
Wood does imply at one point that he didn't originally want to employ Bolton because he didn't look the part quite so good in the photo opportunity. And I often wonder with Trump just how much photo opportunity is actually obsessing him. That was almost what I felt he was satisfied with in North Korea.
Yeah. Well, I think that's right. I think the theatrics of it and the show aspect of it is important to Trump. I think the one other thing that's important to Trump is to do whatever is the opposite of what Barack Obama did. Right? And so I think Trump cares more about pulling out of the Iran deal, full stop, and then we're done, and then that's it, right? The details of who gets a waiver, it's just those details are not as important to him. I do think that he is probably not itching to start a boots-on-the-ground war in the Middle East. He did actually campaign on that and it's the one area where some national security professionals are inclined to agree with him and are somewhat dismayed that he has not been able to roll back the to end the war in Afghanistan. He's continued it somewhat reluctantly, but he's so I do wonder if Bolton pressed that, whether he would get very far with Trump. But Trump also has a lot of respect for the military. I don't know that the military is pushing for a war with Iran either, but there are some countervailing pressures that come from within Trump that at least may restrain him in Iran. But I would not, if I were a betting person, I would not put money on any person in this administration staying for, I'd measure it in months, just as a matter of policy. Yes.
Could I follow up on the question about Europe and the transatlantic relations? You say that some elements are new and some are old, in kind of the trend that's going down.
Yeah.
To what extent are the new elements, so what Trump brings, irreversible? So if in 2 years or in 6 years we have a new president, how can we see? Does the relationship evolve from there, or does it continue on that trend?
People are starting to worry about this a lot, right? Some of this takes the form of worry about the liberal international order. If you believe it ever existed. We spend a lot of time in academic circles talking about, was there ever a liberal international order? Was there an order? Was it liberal? How international was it? It's an important question, obviously. I think some of the things that I've talked about, can you ever depolarize? That's a question that is bedeviling anybody who studies anything to do with American politics, foreign or domestic policy. I don't like to be a fearmonger, but I go back to, we have a lot of evidence from a lot of different types of social science that when there's an external enemy, it generates internal unity, right? So that's one reason why I keep pointing to the rise of China. Not that I would want that to happen, but if you just ask me as an analytical matter what would reverse some of these trends, that was some of this is about there's no common thread that we can all agree on, right? And 9/11 was not that for a variety of reasons. So, or it was for a while, but it didn't have the, it didn't actually reverse a lot of these trends. So, again, I say that purely as sort of analytical matter, like what are the types of things that could reverse it? Now, there are other things. There's some suggestion that maybe people will be fed up with the centralization of power. There's some, if you want to get deeply in the weeds of how Congress works, much the way Parliament, we've all been reading up on what the 1922 committee is this week in the UK, right? These deeply internal matters of how parties and Parliament works. Same thing in Congress, and there have been trends where the leader in the Senate, Senator Mitch McConnell, has centralized his own power, and maybe you get a backlash that would generate some independence from him, which would help with the polarization, at least in the Senate. The Senate is really where most of the action is on foreign policy and national security. So there are some things you could point to. I do worry this is a little bit like trying to put the toothpaste back in the bottle. It's hard. It's in the absence of some forcing mechanism or crisis like the rise in China. It's hard. Sorry to be such a... I don't like to end on a pessimistic note. So ask me a question where I can be optimistic. Yes.
Okay, it might not be a good one for optimism. To what extent do you think the Russia inquiry...
Oh, boy.
has constrained or may continue to constrain Trump, depending on what
Oh, boy. I think we're going to find out pretty soon from what... the rumor, I mean, it's all rumors. That is the one place in Washington that does not leak. The Russia inquiry, at least the Mueller investigation, Robert Mueller's investigation, does not leak. It's pretty clear that this is something that occupies a lot of the president's mental energy. And so that is the risk that he will do something to distract from it or change the subject. The midterms were such a thing for a while, and that's over. Even that, the caravan, which was a really the way that was handled and used was really a terrible story. So I think that it's not in the absence. I mean, obviously, if there turns out to be a smoking gun that none of us know about, then all bets are off, right? But let's assume that isn't going to happen, and I think most people agree that's probably not the likeliest outcome. There's going to be some sort of report. It may implicate some people. Whether it gets as far as the president is not really knowable at this stage. I think we as people who follow national security and foreign policy would be interested in two things. One, we forget that this is fundamentally about how the Russians interfered in our election and what steps can we take to prevent it from happening again, and will Trump follow through on those actions. That's where I think Congress, and especially with the Democratic chamber, that's where the Senate and the House may actually be in alignment, right? Because the Republican senators should find that something they would want to do. And the Senate Intelligence Committee is led at the moment by Richard Burr, who's very much conducted a bipartisan investigation with Senator Mark Warner Democrat from Virginia. The ranking member is the minority leader on a committee. They've been conducting what, by all accounts, is a pretty good investigation in the Senate. You might see common cause there to put some real constraints on what the president does to take action to prevent this kind of action to happening again in the future. On the personal issue of Trump and his family, that's where what you might see is some diversionary action in some other way, picking a fight with somebody. Who is anybody's guess? But I would not want to be the person. I would not want to be the world leader flying to go meet Trump at the Oval Office on the day that report is announced. That much I can say. Yes.
What would you say that Trump or the U.S. administration would say about their role as a leader or innovator in global governance? Particularly, it seems to me that on the one hand they might innovate in some ways, but then there's a substantial barrier that by some of the US's actions, it's sort of, I can sort of see a few problems. What would you say current US administration would say about its role in global governance?
Unfortunately, I think there's a clear answer to this question.
Make America.
They don't like global governance at all. They don't think that the U.S. has a role in should play a big role in global governance. They think bilaterally. Or at least Trump thinks bilaterally. He wants to make individual deals with individual countries. He doesn't like doing things at the global level, and he's trying to pull the United States away from the institutions of global governance. And the question is, will they survive without U.S. leadership? Many of them might. I mean, there's been some interesting scholarship on what the stability mechanisms are, and it's often the leadership of other smaller countries. Some very interesting work by a scholar named Paul Post on that at the University of Chicago. But that is one of those core beliefs that Trump has, that multilateral... The term global governance is the kind of phrase that he just reacts viscerally to. I mean, you can almost see it. And he wouldn't attend Macron's, what was it, the Paris...
Yeah.
Paris peace something. I'm blanking on the the forum that he held after the 100th anniversary of World War I, right? It's just not Trump's, doesn't believe in it.
Focused on making America great again, rather than.
I agree that that's not him slightly taking a punt, that by not agreeing with it, it seems that people will either sort of, he's sort of undermine people. Does he not think that by taking such a risk, he's potentially giving power to future power, to emerging powers, to say, well, Trump's going to disagree with global governance and we agree with it. I mean, that's what the critics of his approach have said, right? The TPP. So the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was intended to be. It wasn't. It was generated to be a way of countering China, right? To have a grouping of states with a free trade agreement that would help, counterbalance China in the Pacific Rim. And he pulled the United States out of it. Now, you may think it was a bad treaty. There are people who think it was a bad treaty who are not opposed to global governance. But leaving the merits of the particular deal aside, what a lot of people would say is if the United States does not step up to take the lead, then China will. Mm-hmm. So there's a vacuum. But he does not seem to agree. He wants to make bilateral deals that he thinks will enhance U.S. power. That's his view. It may be. There's a lot of people who disagree with it and think that it's wrong, but it's one of the few things that we can identify as core for him. And it's just very clear from the reporting on his travels and his agenda and the trips he cancels on or stays in the hotel room, like anything to do with that stuff, he doesn't much care for. It's a very heavy lift to get him to participate. What role do you think then international institutions have in actually their responsibility to counter that, because that's not the way the world should be going. Having a global leader who's basically denouncing any responsibility.
I mean, that's a normative question, but if you
and you only have 1 minute to answer.
If you believe that these institutions are valuable, then I think some sort of survival mechanism until. To get on the agenda of the next administration is what a lot of them are doing, right? Or just simply like in the most recent, I think it was NATO summit last summer. Maybe it was G20, but I think it was NATO. There was a lot of work that was done at the ministerial level, which is, by the way, always where it's done, right? The real work is always done by the deputy principal. Mm-hmm. Whatever, it varies by country, but it's that's where the agreements are hashed out, and then the president flies in and deals with the last crucial details, and then there's right. But in this case, there's been so many times when Trump has, think of the communique in Canada where he agreed to it and then got on the plane and denounced it, right? Angrily denounced it, embarrassed Trudeau and everything. Because of that, they've been doing all this ministerial stuff and just cutting him out of the loop, right? And so there will be ways in which institutions will try to adapt and survive. And some people, quite rightly, I think, make the argument that all that's happening is American influence over these institutions, which are not going to go away, is diminished. And that's not necessarily good for America either. But that argument does not seem to resonate with President Trump. It's been made many times. So,
thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for the very interesting questions.
I definitely learned a lot. I hope everyone found it useful and interesting. Thank you for coming along, and have a nice weekend.
Thank you.